God is dead, and we have killed him. Beyond good and evil. Calm down. To all the Bible thumpers in the comments, I understand you. That's not meant to be an atheistic statement. I assure you, you can still watch this video and be a Christian afterwards. To be honest, I've read a lot of his books, so if you're worried, then I really should be. But relax. Friedrich Nietzsche is not in any way comparable to some college atheist professor who writes, "God is dead" on the chalkboard of your first Libtard 101 lecture. That was only Friedrich Nietzsche's diagnosis. Nietzsche is probably one of the most dangerous, misunderstood, but also aura-farmed philosophers who ever lived. A quick note on aura. We've seen way too many of these alt-left mustaches in Austin, so I think we should start growing mustaches in the crypto-fash Nietzsche way. So Nietzsche wasn't announcing the death of God with joy. He was describing what he thought was the greatest catastrophe in human history, but moreover warning us about what comes next. Because when the source of all meaning, all morality, and all authority disappears, human beings won't naturally become free and rational. We become nihilistic. And nihilism, when left unchecked, has destroyed every civilization that was ever possible. So here is where Nietzsche gets quite explosive for our story. Once he diagnosed this problem, he provided us a solution. And his solution wasn't democracy or equality or human rights. It was the creation of a new aristocracy based on the will to power, one who has the courage to create values and the strength to live without comforting illusions about human nature. The philosopher with a hammer. So Friedrich Nietzsche in 1888 is in his final year of sanity, if you can call it that. With desperate intensity he writes because he knows his mind is failing and he has so little time left to complete his work. He's analyzing his ideas, and he's philosophizing with a hammer. He tests every belief, every value, and every sacred cow to see if it rings true or sounds hollow. What he discovered in this process was that virtually everything modern people believe about morality, progress, and human nature is built upon foundations that already crumbled. We are living in the ruins of Christianity, and we don't even realize it. We're trying to maintain Christian values like equality and compassion and universal love, but the God who gave those values meaning is dead. This creates what Nietzsche calls nihilism. It's not active recognition of all values, but a show, an unconscious recognition that our values have no real foundation. People are going through the motions, and they believe in human rights and democracy and moral progress, but deep down, they sense, if they can, that it's all arbitrary. It's all just human conventions with no ultimate grounding. So most people respond to this crisis by either denying it exists or desperately trying to find new, secular foundations for the old values. But Nietzsche understood that there's no going back. Now that we've seen through the illusion and that there are no objective moral facts, we can't unsee this. So the question now is, what do we do with this terrifying freedom? Master morality versus slave morality. So Nietzsche's answer begins with a genealogy of morals, and it reveals something shocking about the values that we all take for granted. What we call good and evil aren't timeless truths that we discovered through reason or were revealed by God, but instead they're weapons that different types of human beings have used in their struggle for power. Originally, Nietzsche argues that morality was simple and aristocratic. The strong, the noble, the healthy, the beautiful. We were good, and the weak, the sick, and the ugly, the base, were bad. It wasn't a moral judgment in our sense, it was more like a recognition of natural and different levels of human excellence. But something revolutionary happened. The weak, led by priests and intellectuals, created a new kind of morality based on resentment against these betters. They couldn't compete with the strong on the basis of strength, so they changed the rules of the game. They declared that weakness was actually goodness, and that suffering was noble, and that humility was virtuous. This slave morality created new values, and it inverted the old ones completely. What the masters called good, like strength, pride, and excellence, became evil. What the masters called bad, like weakness and humility and self-denial, that became good. And the inversion was so successful that it eventually conquered the entire Western world through what we know as Christianity. The result is that we now live in a world where natural aristocracy of excellence has been replaced by an artificial aristocracy of victimhood. The people who claim moral authority are those who can demonstrate the greatest suffering, the deepest oppression, and the most complete powerlessness. The will to power. Nietzsche didn't stop with just analyzing history. He went deeper, to what he sees as the fundamental drive behind all life. The will to power. And it's not necessarily a desire to dominate others, but it's the basic impulse we all have to expand, to overcome, and to impose our own values on the world around us. Everything alive has the will to power. Plants have it when they grow toward the sun. Animals have it when they compete for territory and mates, and human beings have it when we create art, build civilizations, or develop philosophical systems. He says even the weak have will to power, they just express it differently, through things like moral condemnation and emotional manipulation and the politics of resentment. A crucial insight here is that there are no neutral, objective values that exist independently of will to power. So every moral system, every political philosophy, and every institution is someone's will to power made manifest. The question isn't whether we should have will to power, because we can't help having it. The question is how we are going to express it. Now, most people express their will to power reactively, through resentment against others who are stronger, more beautiful, or more excellent. They can't create their own values, so they define themselves in opposition to someone else's values. They don't know what they want, but they know what they hate. But a few rare individuals can express their will to power creatively. They don't need to tear down other people's values because they are capable of creating their own. They don't define themselves in opposition to others because they are too busy becoming who they actually are, or who they were meant to be. These are what Nietzsche calls the free spirits, and they represent the only hope for overcoming this nihilism. The Übermensch and the Last Man. So Nietzsche envisions two possible futures for humanity after this death of God, symbolically. Most people will become what he calls the last man, a comfortable, safe, and utterly mediocre being. The last man has given up on greatness, excellence, and the difficult work of creating meaning. He just wants to be happy, healthy, and undisturbed. He represents the triumph of slave morality over all aristocratic values. He doesn't want to rule or be ruled. He just wants to consume and be entertained. So, he's not evil in a dramatic sense, but boring, shallow, and completely satisfied with his own mediocrity. Nietzsche also envisions another possibility, der Übermensch, the Overman who has overcome both traditional morality and nihilistic despair. The Übermensch doesn't need God or objective moral laws because he's capable of creating his own values through the pure expression of his will to power. This isn't a biological evolution, it's a spiritual transformation available to those rare individuals who have the courage to live without comforting illusions. But Nietzsche does say that the Übermensch accepts complete responsibility for creating meaning in a meaningless universe, and thus he would look like a new species. So he doesn't need approval from others because he's become his own source of values. Most importantly, the Übermensch represents a return to aristocratic excellence after a long detour through this egalitarian slave morality he calls. The Übermensch embodies natural hierarchy, and it's not through birth or social position, but through spiritual achievement, the achievement of becoming who he is without needing external validation or support. Nietzsche has another test for those who wish to overcome nihilism. It's the thought of eternal recurrence. What if you had to live your exact same life over and over and over again, infinite times, with every moment of suffering, boredom, and disappointment repeated endlessly? Most people are horrified by this thought. They're only getting through life once by telling themselves that things will get better, and that their suffering has some ultimate purpose, and that death will bring either rest or reward. Take away these consolations, and life would become unbearable. But the Übermensch says yes to eternal recurrence. He loves life so completely and has become so fully who he actually is that he would gladly live it infinite amount of times without changing anything. His life isn't free from suffering. He's learned to love even this suffering as a part of what makes him who he is. So this is the ultimate aristocratic attitude. It's taking complete responsibility for your existence without needing it to be justified by anything outside or anyone outside. The Übermensch doesn't need his life to serve God's plan or contribute to human progress or make the world a better place. He lives for the sheer excellence of living well. The politics of excellence. So what would this mean politically? Well, Nietzsche is careful to not offer a detailed political program, but his implications are clear enough. Democracy, with all its assumptions that all opinions are equally valid, is incompatible with his pursuit of excellence. Egalitarianism, with its demand that everyone be treated the same regardless of their capabilities, is a form of spiritual poison. The future belongs either to the last man or to the Übermensch, either to comfortable mediocrity or aristocratic excellence, and there's no middle ground. Since most people will choose comfort over greatness, any society that gives them political power will inevitably choose the path of decline. So the excellent should rule over everyone else. Well, not really. The Übermensch is beyond good and evil. He's not interested in imposing his values on others or even creating institutions that serve his interest. All he's focused on is the task of becoming who he is. It does mean, though, that any healthy society needs to protect and nurture the conditions where his excellence can flourish. It needs to resist the leveling tendencies of mass democracy and create a space where the very few who are capable of greatness can pursue it without interference from the resentful many. Breeding of excellence. Nietzsche sometimes writes about this in terms of breeding, as in creating conditions where excellent human beings are likely to emerge. Now, hold on, this isn't literal eugenics. Some of his followers have taken this in that direction, but he meant it as a cultural and spiritual selection for the qualities that make authentic human existence possible. So what are those qualities? Well, courage, creativity, independence, and the ability to stand alone, the willingness to take risks, and the capacity for joy in the face of your suffering. These are what's distributed not equally over the population. And he says they couldn't be created by education or social reform. They're innate, but they can be encouraged or discouraged by cultural institutions. A culture that celebrates victimhood over achievement, that prioritizes safety over excellence, and that values of conformity are more valuable than creativity. Such a culture would systematically select against the very qualities it needs to avoid decline. So this is why Nietzsche is so critical of modern democratic culture. It's not that democracy is evil, it's that it's systematically hostile to the emergence of greatness. It rewards this mediocrity of the last man. It punishes the excellence of the Übermensch, and the spiritual atmosphere where he could breathe is suffocated. Art versus politics. So for Nietzsche, his alternative to democratic politics wasn't authoritarian politics. It was aesthetic creation. The truly excellent wouldn't waste their time trying to rule these stupid masses. They would focus on creating works of art, philosophy, and their culture that emphasize these higher values. This is why Nietzsche writes so much about artists and musicians like Wagner and poets, because they represent the prototype of the Übermensch, the higher type, that create new values through this work, and they're not consuming or rearranging any existing values. They didn't get democratic validation, and they didn't need it, because their authority came from their creative power. But this creates a fundamental tension. If the excellent withdraw from politics to focus on cultural creation, who is then left to shape institutions that determine whether this excellence can flourish? If the Übermensch is truly beyond good and evil, how would society protect itself from the nihilistic chaos that emerges when traditional values collapse? Nietzsche doesn't have a satisfying answer to this question. And this is part of what makes his philosophy so dangerous. He's so brilliant at diagnosing the spiritual crises of modernity, but he's much less helpful at providing practical guidance for navigating that crisis without falling into nihilism or authoritarianism. The modern relevance. So why would Nietzsche matter for understanding contemporary right-wing thought? Mostly because he provided the sophisticated analysis of why liberal democracy tends towards spiritual decline, and because he showed that the alternative to decline isn't a return to traditional authority, but the creation of a new form of excellence. So think about every time someone complains about participation trophy culture, or every time that someone argues that inequality is natural and necessary, like Bowden, or even every time someone insists that all opinions can't be equally valid. They're all channeling these Nietzschean insights about the difference between excellence and mediocrity. Moreover, when individuals withdraw from mainstream institutions to create alternative platforms, when they focus on culture rather than political change, when they emphasize the importance of individual excellence over collective action. Sorry to ramble, but they're all following the path that Nietzsche laid out. Yet, they also grapple with the same tensions that Nietzsche never resolved. How do they create a space for excellence without falling into elitist contempt for ordinary people? How do you resist democratic leveling without embracing authoritarian hierarchy? And how do we overcome nihilism without creating a new form of fanaticism? The aristocracy of the spirit. This is Nietzsche's contribution to our story, the insight that crisis of modernity is fundamentally spiritual, and that it can only be overcome by an individual who has the courage to overcome and create their own values. These individuals will represent a natural hierarchy based on spiritual achievement rather than birth or social position. This aristocracy of spirit wouldn't rule through conventional political power. It would rule through its cultural influence and through the creation of new possibilities for excellence in a metapolitical way, and mostly through the preservation of standards that prevent society from sliding into complete mediocrity. But it is an aristocracy nonetheless, a recognition that human beings are not equal for our capability towards greatness, and that any society that ignores this inequality will systematically select against its own best possibilities. The question this raises now, is, can this aristocracy exist within our democratic institutions? Or will democracy inevitably tend towards the triumph of the last man over the Übermensch? And if democracy is incompatible with excellence, what kind of political arrangement should we try to flourish? These are the questions, again, that every thinker in our series has to grapple with. But they all start, or owe homage to, Nietzsche's devastating insight that old sources of meaning and authority are dead, and the only alternative to nihilistic decline is the creation of new forms of excellence by those rare individuals who have the courage to live without these comforting illusions. Next time, we're going to see how another man took these insights about cultural decline and aristocratic excellence, then used them to create the most influential theory of civilizational cycles ever written. Get ready to meet the prophet of our Western decline.